Okay, welcome everyone. So today we have 4 speakers to give a review about our COFFIES near-surface shear layer theme. Our 4 speakers are Nick Featherstone from Southwest Research Institute. Nick is co-lead of the COFFIES near-surface shear layer theme, and he's primarily interested in rotating fluid dynamics, particularly as it applies to the solar dynamo problem. And the second speaker will be Loren Matilsky from University of Colorado Boulder. Loren is broadly interested in computational fluid dynamics, and in particular how convection interacts with magnetism in rotating stars. And the third speaker will be Junwei Zhao from Stanford University. Junwei studies local helioseismology on the sun's interior flows, including convection, rotation, and marginal circulation. He is also interested in imaging the sun's far-side active regions and the sunspot interior dynamics. And the last speaker will be Rudi Komm from National Solar Observatory. Rudi is lead of the COFFIES near-surface shear layer theme and the COFFIES helioseismology team. His research focuses are subsurface flows from ring diagram helioseismology, and his main scientific research interests are the dynamics of the near-surface shear layers and the interaction between magnetic flux and subsurface flows. So we have 4 speakers altogether, and we'll let Nick start the talk first.
Thanks, Teresa. Let me share my screen. Okay, does that look like full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm kicking off this near surface shear layer theme seminar. Just sort of a brief outline. I'm really just here to give an overview, not present anything new. Loren Matilsky will follow me and talk a little bit about simulating differential rotation in the sun and some aspects of the near surface shear layer. Then Junwei Zhao is going to talk some about time distance analysis of this region of the sun. And Rudi will talk some about ring diagrams and global helioseismology results for the near surface shear layer. So just really quick, when we're talking about the near surface shear layer, what we're talking about is we know the sun rotates differentially with fast equators and slow poles relative to the mean frame rate. And if you look at how this differential rotation varies as a function of radius, the differential rotation transitions to solid body rotation in the deep sun and the tachocline. But as we approach the photosphere, we also see a diminishment in the differential rotation of something like 5%. And this region, which occupies something like the outer 30 megameters of the sun, is what we call the near surface shear layer. And some big questions, the really broad questions pertaining to this region are, how is it maintained? What makes it distinct from the bulk of the convection zone? And what role might it play in the dynamo process? And we have several people on in the COFFIES Center working on these broader questions, and we'll just hear a little bit from a few people today on these topics. So when I think about the near surface shear layer, I think what's interesting. Well, first of all, it really is our window in a lot of ways into the deep convection zone. When we probe the differential rotation, we can do that with global modes, which go really very, very deep. They image the differential rotation throughout the convection zone and into the radiative zone. But when we want to measure these smaller scale, non-axisymmetric convective flows, we're really limited to what we can do with local helioseismology. And with local helioseismology, we can probe really down through the near surface shear layer, and that's about it as far as the convection goes. There are, of course, some deeper measurements of meridional flow, but this region which is kind of a mystery in its own way, is where we're really looking when we probe with local helioseismology. And there's some mysteries there. The figure on the right now is a little outdated. The disagreement isn't as bad as it used to be. But when you look at this region with ring diagram analysis and time distance, you come up with some conflicting results related to the amplitude of the convective flow. And so this bears in some ways on what's been sort of termed the convective conundrum in the field, for those of us who really think about how the differential rotation in the sun is driven. And this is sort of a term given to a broader, really multiple problems. But one is just, where is the large scale power? We might expect to see power on scales of convection commensurate with convections on depth. We don't seem to see that, certainly not in the photosphere. The power peaks at the supergranular scale and then diminishes from there. And when we run models that have a solar-like differential rotation, we tend to see power on much larger scales, 100 megameter scales or so. But also, as we push those models toward more solar-like parameter regimes, we also often tend to run into what we refer to as an anti-solar differential rotation. So this kind of, the near surface shear layer is probably our window into this problem. What is the structure of deep convection, and how does that relate to the differential rotation that we can observe throughout the convection zone? What's interesting in this region, so if you think about how rotation impacts the convection and the mean flows that the convection wants to drive, it's helpful to think of this in terms of a Rossby number, which is really just the rotation period divided by the convective time scale. And so if your convective time scale is very short, your Rossby number can be very high. And when it's really long, your Rossby number can be very low. And it's in the low Rossby number limit that we tend to get this sort of solar-like differential rotation in models. But we know, because we can measure, for instance, supergranulation in the near surface shear layer, that is absolutely operating in the high Rossby number limit. And so if the entire convection zone were operating in that limit, we would expect this so-called anti-solar differential rotation, where you have vast poles and a retrograde equator in the rotating frame. And so one interesting thing about the near surface shear layer is it's really this transition region between two different dynamical regimes. And I think it's fair to say that how that transition occurs is not particularly well understood yet. When people have tried to model it directly, they can get some semblance of a near surface shear layer in their models. And this is just a sampling of 3 different sets of simulations. The 2 by Guerrero and Matilsky, those are actually targeted at the sun. But the basic dynamics that are at work here pop up in other studies too. And so in the lower left, this is something that was really from a study focused on banded zonal winds in Jupiter. And I like the image there, because you can see there is this kind of region about a third of the way down through this particular simulation where the dynamics really change, and they go from the convective flows, which you're seeing imaged here in red and blue, really the vertical component of those flows is rather disorganized in the near surface layers, and then it's sheared out by the large scale differential rotation depth. And it seems like it's relatively easy, I don't know if that's quite the word I'm looking for, to get some shear behavior in the near surface regions in the equatorial zone of models. But it seems a lot tougher to sustain that shear in the polar regions. And so that's something that Loren may touch on a bit in his presentation. The other thing I think that's interesting about the near surface shear layer is something that it's really, we're thinking about a boundary layer of the sun where the dynamics are probably much different than what's occurring deeper down, say midway through the convection zone. And something that has always sort of puzzled me was this fact that the temperature variation and latitude in the sun is very small, and it's something like a factor of 10 below what we would expect. But when we have systems that drive a differential rotation, if you look carefully at really any of the papers that haven't imposed a constant flux at the upper boundary and have modeled solar-like differential rotation, you'll see you tend to get variations in convective flux with latitude, which are something like 10 to 30%. And that's not at all what we're seeing in the sun, right? We don't see that the sun has, 10 or 30% more emissivity at the poles than at the equator. But I do think it's worth pointing out, this isn't just from models. This isn't like, well, okay, so the simulations don't have it right. If you look at other rotating objects in the solar system, particularly the gas and ice giants, you actually do see variations in heat flux that coincide with the differential rotation in the way that we would expect from models. And so I've just got one example here. And this is just a composite image that's taken actually from a simulation paper by Krista Soderlund, but you can see that reference if you're interested at all. But when you measure the zonal flow on Neptune, you see that at least in the surface layers that we can observe, it actually has an anti-solar differential rotation. And so it's in the rotating frame, it's got kind of a retrograde equator and prograde poles. And these lines over here just represent two sets of measurements or two separate fits to Voyager data. But there's a pretty substantial variation in heat flux and latitude that goes along with that, presumably because this thing is in a thermal wind balance. And it's about 10 or 15%. So this isn't just from models that this isn't like, oh, the simulations just aren't getting it right. There are other objects in space that we can look at and say those behave like we would expect. And what I hope Loren touches on a little bit in his presentation is this relatively recent result of his, where he said, suppose instead of fixing the temperature at the upper boundary, I actually fix the flux so that the convection in these models is forced to have no latitudinal variation in the flux. And when he went through this numerical experiment with a whole suite of models, he found that actually imposing a fixed flux tends to help the contours of differential rotation become more solar-like. And so whatever's going on in the actual sun, we're observing it in the near surface shear layer, a region where, for instance, the contours of the differential rotation do change. And so I think there's a lot of kind of interesting ideas that sort of tie together in this region. You have changes in dynamics, you have questions of how you maintain this region, and you have links that maybe weren't so obvious to other observations. And I really like this this work of Loren's because it links these two questions. And so that's actually all I have to say. I just kind of wanted to set the scene. And so we'll hear from Loren, and then from Junwei, and then from Rudi. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nick. I think that was a nice introduction to the near surface shear layer, sort of why we're interested in it dynamically and what are the outstanding questions. Right, so I'm discussing convective maintenance of differential rotation. And by the way, I have 15 minutes, is that right? Just to make sure. Is that, sorry, that was a question. Is 15 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, convective really means, I think in this context, Bussy columns or Taylor columns. So we have the differential rotation of the sun that we know and love. And then we think at least the solar-like part of this differential rotation, fast equator slope poles, is maintained by these convective rolls, which I call Bussy columns. They're also Taylor columns or banana cells. And basically they're alternating rolls of vorticity. And I think they play a role both in the near surface shear layer, which I'll discuss, and the these pole to equator temperature variations that Nick was touching on. Okay, well, just briefly review the differential rotation. I think we don't need to spend too much time on this, but basically we know the differential rotation from Helios seismology. There's strong differential rotation throughout, so the surface kind of differential rotation imprints downward through the convection zone. And then the two things that I'll be focusing on, I borrowed these slides from somewhere else, they're a little confused, but the iso-rotation contours are significantly tilted, as Nick mentioned. So in the bulk of the convection zone, they're basically along these 25-degree angles with respect to the rotation axis. And also there's two shear layers. There's the tachocline, which I'll not discuss. And then so near surface shear layer should be in yellow, but the near surface shear layer is where the contours all bend equatorward. And what this means is if you go along a fixed latitude as a function of radius, the rotation rate drops. So it drops by about 5% over the outer 5% of the sun. I'll be discussing simulations with the Rayleigh code, which Nick was primary author, and then now it's an open source software supported by the NSF and computational infrastructure for geodynamics. And basically, the main things about this code is that it can simulate stratified convection. So the background density can vary by appreciable amounts. This is the important part of the near surface shear layer work. Typically, it varies by a factor of 20, but we've gone up to 150 in my work. And the first thing you see, this is an example of one of the simulations. This is the radial velocity on a spherical surface. You see the Bousy columns. So that's the main thing I want to point out. There are these downflow lanes aligned with the rotation axis. And they're more turbulent than the cartoon picture, but they're alternating rolls of vorticity. You have a downflow and then an upflow. And so you have one roll and then the other rolls are neighboring. Okay, well, in the near surface shear layer, I mentioned that the rotation rate falls by 5% over the outer 5% of the sun. So the reason that that is interesting is this means that the rotation rate is proportional to 1 over r. It's also important for the global dynamos. The near surface shear layer is interesting because it's generally the tachocline is attributed the major role in the global dynamo, just because the shear is believed to be very strong. But the near surface shear layer, I feel like, is kind of the unsung player. And it's actually quite a bit closer to the surface where sunspots emerge than the tachocline is. So I think there's significant shear in the near surface shear layer, and it should be, it probably has a role in shaping the dynamo. But anyway, that's a separate issue. The idea for a long time was that and I think Nick touched on this as well, is that the near surface shear layer is a result of well-mixed angular momentum. This goes back to arguments by Foucault and Jukipi, I think, in 1975. That also, the other reason the near surface shear layer is interesting is we've known about it for a very long time, or something like its existence. So even before helioseismology, what people could do is look at active regions that are advected by the differential rotation. And what they noticed is that passive tracers would move significantly slower than the active regions. And the hypothesis was that the active regions were anchored deeper down, and that the rotation rate must be stronger deeper in the sun. So there was some kind of semblance of a near surface shear layer, not its structure with latitude or anything detailed like that, but people knew that there was an increase in rotation rate with depth. And so the original hypothesis that goes back 50 years was this homogenization of angular momentum, except this is actually a significant discrepancy, because if it was just homogenized angular momentum, omega would go, the rotation rate would go down as 1 over r squared, and we observe it going down as 1 over r. Anyway, this was kind of the idea behind our work in this paper, was to examine the influence of density contrast, or really examine the influence of rotational constraint. If you mix the angular momentum in the outer 5% of the simulation, could you get a near surface shear layer? And so the experiment, which was really derived from Nick's idea, was to basically take a fixed shell of fluid and just increase the density stratification within the shell. And the reason that that creates a well-mixed outer layer is that it both creates faster flows. So Nick mentioned the Rossby number, and the Rossby number, you can increase it in two ways. You can decrease the scale of the motion, so smaller scale convection, or you can raise the velocity. And both of these effects would be a higher Rossby number. So we imagine there's beneath the near surface shear layer, we have rotationally constrained things that are dominated by Bussy columns, and then fast, small scale, rotationally unconstrained stuff. And the reason this mixes angular momentum is if it's rotationally unconstrained, the idea is that the fluid parcels will conserve their angular momentum in motion, and turbulent diffusion in the model as viscosity will dissipate that angular momentum. And so you just have fluid parcels moving angular momentum very efficiently and homogenizing the layer. And so we tested this idea. If you increase the density stratification, the reason, well, let me not get into that. Just, you can ask me later, but believe me, if you increase the density stratification, you get a rotationally unconstrained outer layer. So we looked at two cases, one with 3 density scale heights, contrast 20, and one with 5, contrast 150. We rotated 3 times solar to avoid these overall anti-solar states, this convective conundrum. And the results were sort of lukewarm. The increasing the stratification did something, but it definitely didn't reproduce a solar-like near surface shear layer. What we saw is that there was no near surface shear in the 3 density scale height case. So these are plots of the rotation rate at fixed latitude as a function of radius. So something happens in the low stratification case, but it's not really near surface shear. The lines kind of flatten out. And we get a weak near surface shear layer. So we get significant near surface shear at low latitudes. So this is actually kind of in line with what we might expect. If you look at this equator, radial profile at the equator, you can compare to the sun, and that's the same order of magnitude. And then something else happens at high latitudes, but it is much weaker. The way we get this, though, is I think what's interesting, is that we clearly achieved this rotationally unconstrained outer layer. This is a movie of case N3, the low stratification case, and case N5. And you can see that both of the convective profiles look similar. We've got Bussy columns at low latitudes. They're a little bit more confused in case N5, but they're still there. And then vortices at high latitudes, these are probably the tops of Bussy columns. But definitely we have much faster convection and smaller scales. And so we have this layer, and actually we looked at the torque balance and we verified that the fluid parcels effectively were conserving angular momentum. So they were doing their damnedest to create a near surface shear layer, but they were not succeeding. And the reason they didn't succeed is basically, so fast small scale stuff when mixing angular momentum, that shows up as a Reynolds stress. So this is the torque balance averaged over the whole simulation for case N5, the high stratification case. And we get a Reynolds stress torque that is blue, which means it's negative. It's trying to remove angular momentum from the outer layers, which should create near surface shear. But it's perfectly well balanced by the meridional circulation. And our interpretation of this is basically that whatever the Reynolds stress tries to do, the meridional circulation seems to move in to counter it. The Reynolds stress removes angular momentum, meridional circulation pumps it back in. And the interesting thing is that we actually know that the sun doesn't do this. So there's a lot of debate on what the helioseismic meridional circulation is below the near surface shear layer, whether it's 1 cell or 2 cells. I don't think that's really a solved question at this point. But in the near surface shear layer, we do pretty much know the profile. And it doesn't have this like thin substructure. So there's not like it's inconsistent with the solar observations that we have a thin layer meridional circulation exactly countering the Reynolds stress. And I think the dynamics of the meridional circulation are really what we don't really understand either in the sun or in these global models. And we have to understand it in order to really address the near surface shear layer in global models. I also want to mention that there's previous work. Well, actually, Gustavo had some simulations that actually had quite convincing near surface shear layers. But mostly it seems that this same kind of phenomenon happens where the Reynolds stress tries to remove angular momentum. This was from Hideyuki Hota's work, I think in 2015. This is a robust phenomenon. And so we need to figure out why the meridional circulation seems to do this. Okay, and then if I did want to touch on this issue of the isorotation contours. I'm gonna kind of speed through this since I think I'm running out of time. But the rotation contours are significantly tilted in the bulk of the convection zone. And this was a surprise for two reasons. We expected flows that were rotationally constrained deep down. This was from initial kind of mixing length type arguments. And so we expected a Taylor-Proudman-like constraint to hold. And in Taylor-Proudman, everything is basically invariant with respect to the rotation axis. That would imply cylindrically aligned contours. And the first simulations, I think this is Brune, Junwei 2002, and actually a lot of current simulations also achieve contours that are cylindrical. And it's hard to consistently get the tilted contours. What we do know is that, and this goes back to the pole to equator temperature gradient, is that the tilt is set by the thermal profile, or it's consistent with the thermal profile. So Mark Misch, 2006, basically just imposed a latitudinal temperature gradient from below, modeled after the tachocline's thermal wind kind of imprinting back up into the convection zone, and basically managed to tilt the contour significantly. So this was at least a proof of concept that you could change the thermal boundary condition and this would have a significant effect on the contours. And so this paper basically just took two sets of models and looked at a fixed entropy case, which is a common type of boundary condition. You just fix the entropy at the outer boundary, and then a fixed flux case where you fix the entropy gradient. And there was no other difference in these models except that. And we found actually remarkably different results. So as Nick mentioned, the contours were significantly tilted in the fixed flux case, and they're tilted in the correct sense. So actually the fixed entropy cases also had tilted contours, but they're tilted in the opposite sense that we'd expect from the sun. And we looked at thermal wind balance, and these were all consistent with the thermal profiles that were getting established. So we didn't impose this gradient like Mark Misch did, but what we found was that the different type of boundary condition actually led to a thermal profile that was significantly different in both of these. And this was consistent with different tilts to the contours. And I'm about out of time, so let me just go to the punchline. Basically, you can calculate, and I did this in the paper, what is the thermal wind temperature associated with the differential rotation. And if you do this, you get that the required differential rotation to tilt the contours is basically 10 Kelvin. And this goes against Mark Rast 2008, or it's not confirmed by observation. So RAS 2008 measured a difference of about 2.5 Kelvin in effective temperature in the sun. And so somehow the sun is pulling off very little variation in effective temperature or emissive flux at the photosphere. And I think that's kind of a mystery, because if the sun is in thermal imbalance, which all evidence suggests that it is, then somehow it is eliminating that 10 Kelvin temperature gradient. And like Nick said, I think this probably has to do with the near surface shear layer. I mean, something is happening in the outer 30%, outer 5% of the sun that is creating a near surface shear layer and probably eliminating temperature gradients. And I'm inclined to think that they're related, although I don't really have any evidence for that. Anyway, that's basically it. So I'm happy to answer any question, or I guess we do questions at the end. So thank you.
I guess that sort of depends on Rudi and Nick, how you want to formulate things. Do you want questions in between, or do you want to save them all to the end?
Well, I would suggest if there's a burning question for Loren right now, have him answer it now.
Yeah, I agree.
I do have a question, but I want to make sure other people have a chance to ask theirs.
Bonnie has a question.
Just a point of clarification. When you say delta T is 10K at deep solar interior, how deep is deep?
Below the near surface shear layer. So this, I didn't mark it unfortunately on this plot, but I only used the data from below the near surface shear layer, and you can see that it's pretty much similar at different radii.
Okay, thanks.
I see a question from Shay in the chat. I don't know if it's burning, but
yeah, that may be something that would be an interesting discussion point at the end. But if you have a comment on it,
let me. That's a good question. The question is, do we need to include atmospheric influences in if we want to address the near surface shear layer? I don't know. I think probably those boundary conditions definitely, I mean, they affect how the system is driven. And there's an order 1 issue here, which is that we're probably driving the large scales too hard. And this is causing this convective conundrum and other things. And it might be that, I would say possibly, although it's hard to address because it's very hard to include that physics in a global model. The Rayleigh number is.
So the question for people who can't see the chat and the recording is, how was the Rayleigh number selected?
Yeah, sorry, in what sense was that a follow-on to something I said?
No, I was trying to clarify the question.
Oh, okay. They are decently supercritical. So we select the Rayleigh number basically indirectly. We have a luminosity which we keep fixed at the suns, and then we have this subgrid scale diffusion which is very high, and so it's supercritical. I think the most supercritical one is like 100, and then you can compare that to the sun, which I think is 10 to the 10 or something. So it's more than 1, but it's much less than in the sun. The density fixed flux, sorry. The density contrasts were all 20. So three density scale heights for the fixed flux paper.
Okay. Well, why don't we move on to Junwei? Thank you, Loren.
Thanks.
So you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here I only have a very brief talk. It's to present what time distance will do for the topic of surface shear layer in the COFFIES project. So first I want to mention what we have. So for the HMI time distance pipeline, we have near surface high spatial resolution flow maps. Also, the temporal resolution is pretty high. We have 8 hours. Every 8 hours, we have one set of subsurface flow maps. By use of these subsurface full disk flow maps, we can generate a flow map, a synoptical flow map for the current rotation. So here is just one example showing the current rotation 2255. It's just last month. So we can have, basically we have almost a near time. It's about a few days behind the real time update for the synoptical flow maps. You can get these results from our website. So what we have is we have a near surface high resolution flow maps. And the other thing we have is a near surface rotation and meridional flow. For these ones, we basically average rotational and meridional flow profiles up to about 20 millimeters in depth by use of the maps in the previous page. So what's shown here is just the torsional oscillation and the residual meridional circulation near the surface. So what we do is just to remove long-term average. So these results are also available online in near real time. So basically we update these results a few days after each current rotation ends. If you want to get these results, you can just go to our website and they are easily available. So the other thing we have, okay, is a low resolution interior meridional circulation. So what's shown here is just one of our past results. Here we don't want to argue how many circulation cells we have in a deeper interior. What we want to emphasize here is for the near surface shear layer from the outer 5% of the solar radius, we only have, for this set of results, we only have about 10 pixels. So the resolution is very low. In terms of temporal scale, we can only have such a map every 2 or 3 years at the best. But for this specific map, we used nearly about 80 years of HMI observations. So the point here is we have low resolution meridional circulation profiles for very low temporal cadence. So it looks like we have high resolution near surface, high temporal cadence near surface, and a low resolution and a low temporal cadence in the interior. So there's something missing here. So what is missing is just the near surface shear layer with a higher spatial resolution and with a higher temporal cadence. So this is our plan for the COFFIES. So in the next few years, we want to focus on this topic. So the plan is to investigate both rotations and meridional circulation from the surface to about 50 millimeters in depth. So for rotations, compared with global heliosseismology, we are able to have hemispheric resolution. We can study the symmetry between 2 hemispheres. For meridional flow, we can also have both hemispheres for sure. We can also have a better temporal cadence. So certainly there are a few obstacles we need to address while developing this new measurement process. So this is a very simple like a scheme plot of latitudes and longitudes. What I want to emphasize is that for local hydroseismic measurements, we need to remove a center to limit effect. What do we do? What are we doing? We do, or most other people do for the removal of the center to limit effect is just to use the horizontal equatorial measurements along this line, along this area. So we use the measurements along this area as a proxy for the central limit effect. But we want to emphasize that the geometries of latitudes and longitudes are very different. So all the latitude lines, they are in parallel, but all the longitude lines in the north-south directions, they are not in parallel. They will cross, they will merge at one point. That's the North Pole and the South Pole. So look at these two shaded regions. They have different shapes, but we just simply use measurements in this area as a proxy for the center to limit effect and remove from this shape. So this is I want to say this introduce huge errors, but when we want to have high precision measurements, this is certainly something we want to solve. So that means we need a better effect removal method. What is that? I don't know. This is something we want to explore for the next few years. The other thing I want to emphasize is the measurements the measuring rotation is not as easy as we would think. For example, if we look at this plot, we take two random points along the same longitude line. So these 2 points will fall in the same grid circle. That means the waves will travel, the acoustic waves will travel along this longitudinal line. So the geometry is very simple. You don't make mistakes. However, if you do the same thing along latitudinal lines, for example, take 30 degrees as one example. If you take 2 points here, one here and the other here, you would think what you measure is along this, the flows along this latitudinal line. That's a mistake. It's not, because the point here and here, they are on a small circle. They are not on the great circle. This blue line is the great circle. So that means what the signal you measure from here to here is not along the east-west direction, but is along this curve. So this is for small distance, it's maybe only a small error, but for a larger distance, if you measure here to here, so this plot may be an exaggeration, but what I want to say is the flows is along a curve high above the latitude you are targeting. So this certainly poses a great challenge when we do inversions. So that means measuring rotations below the photosphere is more difficult than measuring the marine circulation, although the rotation is to order of magnitude stronger than the marine circulation. So these are two primary obstacles we need to solve, we need to address before we can work out our measurement process. So the plan is for the next few years, just want to summarize here, is to develop a new time distance measurement codes taking into consideration of the different geometries of east, west, and north-south directions. I haven't mentioned we also need new sensitivity kernels. We have kernels for high resolution near surface. We have low resolution kernels for the entire convection zone, but we don't have kernels for the near surface layers. So this is something we want to work on next. So in the end, we will develop an inversion code. The final results is we want to have rotation profiles and the marginal circulation profiles for the near surface shear layer with very good temporal cadence. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Junwei. Do we have any questions for Junwei? So just raise your hand. Okay, well, should we move on to Rudi?
Oh, I guess then it's me. Let's see. Once again, I'll try to find my keynote, and I hope you see something that says near surface shear layer global and big winging results. And if I hit play, you see the whole thing in full screen, right?
Yep.
We do.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about some of those results. We all have seen this picture by now, so I don't have to say anything to that because we now heard that. So I can jump right into the next one. And I just, again, from my perspective as a motivator is also, this is the density profile in the convection zone. This is the Model S from JCD. And that also shows you that, as was mentioned before, yeah, there is this boundary between the convection zone and the atmosphere. And so you see this, how this the density really drops several orders of magnitude in the near surface shear layers towards the surface. And the thing with the global and the local helioseismology is that the global ones are good if you in the interior, like you saw the rotation rate profile, and they can go out to probably, let's say, radius 99% or 0.99 and get good results. With a time distance or with a ring diagram, it's the other way around. You sort of, with the high resolution, you're good at the surface, but you only go to, like Junwei said, maybe 20 megameters. What I circle in the dotted line, the orange line, and the right thing is actually 60 megameters, because the error bars go up if you go deeper, and you're sort of meh. And so the interesting thing for what Junwei pointed out, and what we're sort of looking into, what you can do is, because you sort of trust the global rotation rate that you get from the picture, the previous one, you can then also validate what your local techniques tell you, right? I mean, so you can compare it. And so it's good if we can push like the ring diagrams deeper down, then you have also a great overlap between the global and the local results, and you can do a little bit more of that. And we heard before from Loren also that, yeah, the thing is, you have this boundary layer. And so as was mentioned before, some of the question is that what we see at the close to the surface really just that, is at that boundary layer? And we have no idea what's really going on in the convection zone, right? I mean, the stuff below the near surface shear layer. And so what does it tell us? And so that's sort of the interesting thing here too. And so what I'm showing here, this is, Sabani is online. So if I say something wrong or don't explain it, she's the, because this is an Antia Basu paper. And what you can do is, with the global results, as we've seen before, you look at the gradient of the rotation rate with a radius. And so if you do the d log omega, d log r, then as Loren also pointed out, if you plot like in the left one, if you get something of the order -1, and so the colors in the left-hand panel, the different colors are different depths. So the black lines are close to the surface, 0.99, and the blue ones are 0.95. And so you see that, as you expect, since you get them closer to where the rotation rate turns over, it gets them smaller. So you start out with a large negative gradient, and you go close to to 0 as you go deeper down. And so when you compare that then to what the variation is with latitude, well, it changes, but it's a smaller variation compared to what you see as variance in depth. And what you can do then, you say, well, you can define the depth range of the near surface shear layer by saying, okay, the near surface shear layer is everything in that range where my gradient is greater than a certain amount. And they use at 20% of the maximum value. And so then you end up with the plot on the right-hand side, where you can say the depth or the base of the near surface shear layer, where you're close to the turnover, is at the 20% mark. And you can see that it's sort of at around 0.95 at the surface, at the equator. And then as you go up in latitude to higher latitude, then it goes a little bit shallower because it's more like 9.6 a little bit. And the different colors in this plot are then the different instruments like gong, MDI, and HMI. And you see qualitatively they're all the same, and they have a little bit difference in the amplitude. And to try the HMI, the fitting process and all are a little bit different. And so the assumption was, well, maybe if we restrict the HMI data to the 8 coefficients to make it more gong-like, then it should, the discrepancy should be different. And so you see basically the HMI regular data are sort of a little bit above, and when you do the dashed line, and it's below the bluish, blackish, that's the gong line. So yeah, so I think one can sort of understand where the differences come from the different fittings and the different things, but qualitative, it's all the same. And so what you then can do is then what we always look for is there a variation with activity? And so what they did is they created then like you see with the torsion oscillation with all these kind of plots as a function, supersynoptic maps that cover the solar cycles. And so you go, the x-axis is time, y-axis is latitude, and this is at a depth of 0.95, sort of basically the base of the near surface shear layer. And then you see, this looks just like what you see in torsion oscillation, where you have these kind of bands that move towards the equator, and the black dots, those are the locations of sunspots. So red color meaning a positive shift, which means smaller. Remember, the gradient is negative, so you go from minus whatever, and if you have shift towards positive, it gets closer to 0, so the gradient gets smaller. And blue, where you have the quiet sun. And so what that then implies is that where you have the locations of activity, your base is a little bit shallower. So you get closer. So the depth of the near surface shear layer is shallower at the locations where you have the activity, is what you can conclude from that kind of thing. So this is quite nice. And so this is an old plot where you can compare the rotation rate between like rings and the global ones. The blue is the global helioseismology, and red and green dots are gong and MDI data sets. So you can see this is from a solar cycle old. This is a gong and MDI, and they agree reasonably well, except when you go to higher latitude, like 45 degree, the bottom right plot. And there you see the discrepancies getting a bit larger. That is not too much of a surprise, because with a given spatial resolution of your Dopplerograms, if you go to higher latitude, eventually the noise will just catch up with you because of projection effect and all that stuff. So with HMI having a much higher spatial resolution in the Dopplerograms than the MDI or the Gong Dopplerograms. So it would be a good idea to do this kind of comparison again. And my guess is that the plot at 45 degree they would agree much better than in the old ones. And so, but overall, it looks like what you get out of the local helioseismology agrees reasonably well with the rotation rates that you get out of the global helioseismology, which is good, because that's what you want to see. And so from that, you can go forward and compare it with the big ring results. And there was a question in the chat where you can find these time distance maps and these kind of things. The web address, it's the JSOC. This is the HMI data center. And so you can just go to the jsoc.stanford.edu and you find all these maps there. And Junwei has made a very nice website there where you can grab all those kind of flow maps and play with them. And this is the results from the big wings versus the small wings. That's, if you have any questions there, you better ask Rick Bogart. I think he's online here too. He's the one who would know how that all works and where you have to look if you look for specific things. And what you see there, the left-hand side, is the rotation rate or zonal flow, because I subtract the average flow. And this is, so what you see, the red circles are the big wings. Big wings means 30-degree tile diameter versus the standard wings. What standard tiles, what the tiles means is you track a certain area and follow that for a time frame. And the regular ring diagram analysis is like the 15-degree tiles. And as a rough rule, the diameter of the tiles in degree gives you roughly the depth in megameter that you can reach. And so that's what you see here. The regular pipelines, they go, the HMI 15-degree tiles go to 15, 16 megameters with small error bars. That's the blue ones. The gong is the black ones, and they all agree reasonably well. And so you can see how the rotation rate increases. Since I'm doing things in megameters, so that's why I included the line at the 0.95 radius, so to show you where you're roughly at. And I used the inversion results and just interpolated them on an equidistant grid with depth. So the closeness of the grid points should not fool you that you really have that resolution here. At the depth of 30 megameters, yeah, the width is probably plus minus 5 megameters. Okay, so the neighboring grid points are definitely not independent in this plot. And so on the right-hand side, you see the Murnau flow, and there you see that, yeah, again, the agreement is reasonably good. And you see that, yeah, in the upper, what we've always seen is that the amplitudes don't really vary much. I mean, and if you look at just at the blue and black curves, they don't really vary much. But as soon as you use the big rings, you can see that the amplitudes go down, and it looks like, if you just sort of naively extrapolate, you would just say, well, it looks like there could be some crossover a little bit below the near surface shear layer, that you would have a flow reversal and have something else in. So that would be very nice if for example, with the time distance and these things, because that sort of goes along with what Junwei showed in the greater plot, that you have polarized flows in the near surface shear layer, and then below something happens. And this sort of goes along with that. So it would be really nice to follow up on that. And there's the point of the Y local. If you can do all the wonderful stuff with global, there you can see the different hemispheres. The filled symbols are southern hemisphere, the open symbols are the northern hemisphere. So you can distinguish between the hemispheres. And so then solar cycle, you have to look at solar cycle, right? And so the left-hand side is the same kind of plots that you've seen before, just a little bit different. And this is the x-axis is now time. The y-axis in each little plotlet is depth. And so the stack is then from the equator at the bottom, 0 degree, and increase for different latitudes. So you see basically the same thing. It's just you can also have a hint of how it varies with depth. And so this is the zonal flow or rotation rate. And positive means faster than average, blue means negative means slower than average. And so you can see these kind of bands that you usually see in these other plots that move from mid-latitude to the equator. You can see that nicely in the left. Left is the standard ring diagram analysis that we all trust reasonably well. And the right-hand side is the is the one using the 30 degrees. And for just for better signal to noise, this is averaged over both hemispheres. Okay, so this is the average of both hemispheres, and you see that agrees reasonably well. You get the same solar cycle variation throughout the whole near surface shear layer. The right-hand plots are from the surface to 32 degrees, and the one on the left are 0 to 16 degrees. And if you sort of, if you sort of squint and, for example, pick the 30-degree tile, that's the third one on the right-hand side. And if you then go to the left and say, well, yeah, this is sort of 30 degrees versus 15, so it's probably covering the 37 and the 22.5. And if you sort of squint and think how this might be averaged over these kind of, yeah, then you pretty much get what you get on the right. So yeah, so they seem, it hangs together, okay? And you can do the same thing for the Murnau flow. And this is all these plots, the temporal mean has been subtracted, okay? And here the color convention positive or red yellow means poleward, and so you have an excessive poleward flow, and blue means it's less, so it's more towards the equator. But again, these are the residuals. The average Murnau flow on these kind of time scales is poleward. And so what you see there is sort of the convergence towards the mean latitude of activity, that you, instead of having faster and slower, you have sort of converging flows towards the location of activity. And what you see on the left, that's what you see there. And on the right, it's a bit noisier, but you can still see, again, if you squint and sort of mentally average the panels on the left so that you get something like the similar on the right, it agrees reasonably well. So you get these kind of patterns there too. So yes, we can do that. So there's one can, this is just a reminder, the COFFIES as a science theme, the near surface shear layer, as Junwei and others alluded, will work on this for the next couple of years. And here the only important thing is that the thought is that we will have a monthly meeting to discuss these kind of what work has been done, what progress, and sort of hear other people give presentations, because this is just a short limit of what we could show in an hour. And so there will be other presentations. And at this point, we haven't decided on a date yet. The time will probably be something like this, 10 or 11, because that seems to be works for everybody. And Tuesdays seem to be, I stop sharing now. Tuesdays seem to be a fairly overbooked, so it's probably going to be more like a Wednesday, Thursday maybe, because there are some people who don't like meetings on Mondays, on Fridays. But so we'll see. So we'll soon send out a poll to find out what might work or not. But yeah, that's it.
Thanks to the speakers. Time for questions. I see people are already having some small discussion in the chat. Do you want to bring your discussion to talk?
Yeah, I'm still speculating on that plot with I think it was DLN omega DLNR, the difference between the time average as a function of, I think it was a time latitude plot, and then I think there was active regions over plotted.
Right.
Sorry, I'm not describing it very well, but
no. I think
I'm just wondering have we known that, or is this something new? I got confused. It seemed like this was the torsional oscillation, but basically differentiated. Yeah. So okay, this is new.
This is new. Yes.
Okay.
And Sabani can tell, but yeah, because I think Sabani, you can jump in. But it looks like you were quite surprised at how nicely it looks like the torsional oscillation plot.
It does, and yet it doesn't, because it doesn't show the poleward branch.
Right.
So it is, in a sense, exactly what you say. It is, I mean, if you do the mathematics, the torsional oscillation, the derivative of the torsional oscillation will come in somewhere. But what surprised us is we don't see the poleward branch, which is so clear in the torsional oscillation.
Would you see it if it was there? I mean, maybe that's a silly question.
Yeah, we played around with the scales and everything. We would see it. The
Yeah.
errors are tiny.
Yeah, because you would get then something that goes up.
Yeah, we would see it, but we just don't see it.
It does look like there might be some hints of it. Am I just
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing.
on?
Yeah, but that's the problem. It never develops because, see, this is both cycle 23 and cycle 24. And we know in cycle 23, the poleward branch is very, very strong in the torsional oscillation. Let me put my camera on, sorry. I hate smoke. But in cycle 24, the poleward branch of the torsional oscillation is actually very weak. But in this case, we really don't see much of a difference between 24 and 23. But to me, the more surprising result, which I'm sure has some physical basis somewhere, was that you get a similar sort of plot, which Rudi didn't show, of the change in what we define as the base of the near surface shear layer.
Yep.
That changes too.
Yeah,
And
I just sort of discussed and alluded to it, but
yeah,
I
you
didn't-
alluded to it, but I mean, there's a figure that shows that too.
Yeah, is it in the same paper, Sarbani?
Yeah, it's in the same paper. Yeah,
Same paper.
same paper. Yeah. But yeah, we thought this was strange because we didn't see the poleward branch. But ultimately, I mean, Leon is right. Loren, sorry, not Leon, that that has to be related to the torsional oscillation because after all, we're using the same inversions.
Right.
You're just doing the operations in a completely different manner. That's all. So,
Nick?
Is this like, could you take the original map of the torsional oscillations and basically differentiate it? Or is that not possible, basically, given the resolution?
no, because we are doing a radial differentiation and it's the same grid and everything. I mean, we do have maps of the radial differentiation. We might actually already have maps of that. Not 100% sure though. Though maybe we have that of the latitudinal differentiation rather than radial. I don't remember now. Because we did both. So yeah. But you're right, it has to be related. It's the same underlying data set, it's the same underlying inversion. So then the question is, when we do it this way, rather than simply d omega by dr, why don't we see the poleward branch? Maybe something's getting hidden in the, you know, the theta factors somewhere. But yeah.
Nick?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting result. Does this imply that the magnetic field is essential for understanding the operation of the near surface shear layer, or is the near surface shear layer just acting as a filter from stuff that's coming from below somehow? I mean, what's
the chicken? What's the egg?
Well, yeah, exactly.
I wish I knew. I would have thought that the simulations would tell us that. But imagine you would need MHD simulations to figure out. I mean, I imagine the changes in the near surface shear layer has to be dependent on the magnetic fields, given what we see, but whether the presence of the near surface shear layer is, I mean, I thought people like Rudiger, or no, not Rudiger, what's his name? Starts with a K. It's in the paper. I thought he said, I mean, I think one of his papers implied that a magnetic field is essential for a near surface shear layer, but then I didn't know the theory enough. So.
Oh, you can have purely hydrodynamic or magnetic theories for this thing. The one that Loren was talking about is purely hydrodynamic, right?
Yeah, I know, yeah. So because I think, well, hold on, Let me find out the name of this person from the paper because it's really annoying. Not yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Robert. He, if I'm remembering the paper correctly, connected the extent of the near surface shear layer to magnetic fields and stuff. So if you look at our paper, we have the reference there.
Are there any other questions? Thoughts, concerns, ideas, solutions?
The paper of 2016 or the paper of 2005?
Sorry. Gustavo, I'm not sure what exactly you're asking. Who's
There are two references of Kichatynov in your paper.
Yeah, let me check. I have to go back to my notes. I don't remember now.
Let me just open this.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we write papers, so we find the references again.
Of course. Yeah, so the 2016 paper is that the near surface shear layer changes because the turbulent viscosity is suppressed by magnetic fields. So they try to explain the change in the near surface shear layer that way.
Okay, more questions? Everybody's stunned.
I'll just comment to everyone here, if you have any work related to the near surface shear layer that you would like to present in the COFFIES forum, just shoot Rudi or I an email and we'll try to work you into one of the future seminars.
Okay, let's thanks to all the speakers again for today's very nice talk and the interesting discussion. And as same as before, the recording of the seminar will be put online soon after the talk, after the Zoom.